Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be continuing our reading and discussion of the Burton Watson translation of the Lotus Sutra with Chapter 2, Expedient Means. It's been quite a while since we last read and discussed the Lotus Sutra, but we regularly discuss themes and concepts from the text in our regular episodes on other topics, and I think it would be good to return to it for this very important chapter. In this chapter, the concept of upaya, known in Chinese as fangbian, or in Japanese as holben, or in English as skillful means, is described and expounded upon in great detail. In describing this concept, the Buddha turns all of previous Mahayana and early Buddhist doctrine on its head by saying that the three vehicles of enlightenment, that of the Arhats, the Pratyekabuddhas, and the Bodhisattvas, are all skillful means, or teaching tools, and that all three are subsumed under the Ekayana, the Buddha vehicle. We hope you enjoy. At that time, the world-honored one calmly arose from his samadhi and addressed Shariputra, saying, "The wisdom of the Buddhas is infinitely profound and immeasurable. The door to this wisdom is difficult to understand and difficult to enter. Not one of the voice-hearers or Pratyekabuddhas is able to comprehend it. What is the reason for this? A Buddha has personally attended 100, 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000, a countless number of Buddhas, and has fully carried out an immeasurable number of religious practices. He has exerted himself bravely and vigorously, and his name is universally known. He has realized the law that is profound and never known before, and preaches it in accordance with what is appropriate, yet his intention is difficult to understand. Shariputra, ever since I attained Buddhahood, I have, through various causes and various similes, widely expounded my teachings and have used countless expedient means to guide living beings and cause them to renounce their attachments. Why is this? Because the thus come one is fully possessed of both expedient means and the paramita of wisdom. Shariputra, the wisdom of the thus come one is expansive and profound. He has immeasurable mercy, unlimited eloquence, power, fearlessness, concentration, emancipation, and samadhis, and has deeply entered the boundless, and awakened to the law never before attained. Shariputra, the thus come one knows how to make various kinds of distinctions and to expound the teachings skillfully. His words are soft and gentle and can delight the hearts of the assembly. Shariputra, to sum it up, the Buddha has fully realized the law that is limitless, boundless, never attained before. But stop, Shariputra, I will say no more. Why? Because what the Buddha has achieved is the rarest and most difficult to understand law. The true entity of all phenomena can only be understood and shared between Buddhas. This reality consists of the appearance, nature, entity, power, influence, inherent cause, relation, latent effect, manifest effect, and their consistency from beginning to end. At that time, the world-honored one, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, "The hero of the world is unfathomable. Among heavenly beings, or the people of the world, among all living beings, none can understand the Buddha. The Buddha's power, fearlessness, emancipation, and samadhis, and the Buddha's other attributes, no one can reckon or fathom. Earlier, under the guidance of countless Buddhas, he fully acquired and practiced various ways, profound and subtle, and wonderful doctrines that are hard to see and hard to understand. For immeasurable millions of kalpas, he has been practicing these ways, until in the place of practice he achieved the goal. I have already come to see and know completely this great goal and recompense, the meaning of these various natures and characteristics. I and the other Buddhas of the 10 directions can now understand these things. This law cannot be described. Words fall silent before it. Among the other kinds of living beings, there are none who can comprehend it, except the many bodhisattvas who are firm in the power of faith. The many disciples of the Buddhas in the past have given offerings to the Buddhas, have already cut off all outflows, and now are dwelling in their last incarnation. But even such persons as they have not the power needed. Even if the whole world were filled with men like Shariputra, though they exhausted their thoughts and pooled their capacities, they could not fathom the Buddha's knowledge. Even if 10 directions were all filled with men like Shariputra, or, like the other disciples, though they filled the lands in the 10 directions and exhausted their thoughts and pooled their capacities, they could not understand it. If Pratyekabuddhas, acute in understanding, without outflows, in their last incarnation, should fill the worlds in the 10 directions, as numerous as bamboos in a grove, though they should join together with one mind for 1,000,000 or for countless kalpas, hoping to conceive of the Buddha's true wisdom, they could not understand the smallest part of it. If bodhisattvas newly embarked on their course should give offerings to numberless Buddhas, completely mastering the intent of the various doctrines and also able to preach the law effectively, like so many rice and hemp plants, bamboos or reeds, filling the lands in the 10 directions, with a single mind, with their wonderful knowledge, for kalpas numerous as Ganges sands, should altogether pool their thoughts and capacities, they could not understand the Buddha's knowledge. If bodhisattvas who never regress, their number like Ganges sands, with a single mind should join in pondering and seeking, they could not understand it either. I also announce to you, Shariputra, that this profound, subtle, and wonderful law, without outflows, incomprehensible, I have now attained in full. Only I understand its characteristics, and the Buddhas of the 10 directions do likewise. Shariputra, you should know that the words of the various Buddhas never differ. Toward the law preached by the Buddhas, you must cultivate a great power of faith. The world-honored one has long expounded his doctrines, and now must reveal the truth. I announce this to the assembly of voice-hearers, and to those who seek the vehicle of the Pratyeka Buddha. I have enabled people to escape the bonds of suffering and to attain nirvana. The Buddha, through the power of expedient means, has shown them the teachings of the 3 vehicles, prying living beings loose from this or that attachment and allowing them to attain release. At that time, among the great assembly there were voice-hearers, arhats whose outflows had come to an end, Ajnata, Kaundinya, and the others, 1,200 persons. And there were monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen who had conceived a desire to become voice-hearers or Pratyeka Buddhas. Each of these had this thought: now for what reason does the world-honored one so earnestly praise expedient means and state that the law attained by the Buddha is profound and difficult to understand, that it is very difficult to comprehend the meaning of the words he preaches, that not one of the voice-hearers or Pratyeka Buddhas can do so? If the Buddha preaches but one doctrine of emancipation, then we too should be able to attain this law and reach the state of nirvana. We cannot follow the gist of what he is saying now. At that time, Shariputra understood the doubts that were in the minds of the 4 kinds of believers, and he himself had not fully comprehended. So he addressed the Buddha, saying, "World-honored one, what causes and conditions lead you to earnestly praise expedient means, the foremost device of the Buddhas, the profound, subtle, and wonderful law that is difficult to understand? From times past I have never heard this kind of preaching from the Buddha. Now the 4 kinds of believers all have doubts. We beg that the world-honored one will expound this matter. For what reason does the world-honored one earnestly praise this law that is profound, subtle, and wonderful, difficult to understand?" At that time, Shariputra, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, "Son of wisdom, great sage and venerable one, at long last you preach this law. You yourself declare you have attained power, fearlessness, samadhis, concentration, emancipation, and these other attributes, and the law that is beyond comprehension. This law attained in the place of practice, no one is capable of questioning you about. Quote, my intention is hard to fathom, and no one can question me. Unquote. No one questions, yet you yourself preach, praising the path you walk on. Your wisdom is very subtle and wonderful, that which all the Buddhas attain. The arhats, who are without outflows, and those who seek nirvana, now have fallen into the net of doubt, wondering for what reason the Buddha preaches this. Those who seek to become Pratyeka Buddhas, monks and nuns, heavenly beings, dragons and spirits, along with the Gandharvas and others, look at one another, filled with perplexity, gazing upward at the most honored of 2-legged beings. What is the meaning of all this? I beg the Buddha to explain it for us. Among the assembly of voice-hearers, the Buddha has said, I am foremost, yet now I lack the wisdom to solve these doubts and perplexities. Have I in fact grasped the ultimate law, or am I still on the path of practice? The sons born from the Buddha's mouth press palms together, gaze upward, and wait. We beg you to put forth subtle and wonderful sounds, and at this time explain to us how it really is. The heavenly beings, dragons, spirits, and the others, their numbers like Ganges sands, the bodhisattvas seeking to be Buddhas, in a great force of 80,000, as well as the wheel-turning sage kings, come from 10,000s of millions of lands, all press their palms together with reverent minds, wish to hear the teaching of perfect endowment. At that time, the Buddha addressed Shariputra, saying, Stop, stop. There is no need to speak further. If I speak of this matter, then the heavenly and human beings throughout the worlds will all be astonished and doubtful. Shariputra once more spoke to the Buddha, saying, "World-honored one, we beg you to preach. We beg you to preach. What is the reason? Because this assembly of countless hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, millions of asamkhyas of living beings in the past have seen the Buddhas. Their faculties are vigorous and acute, and their wisdom is bright. If they hear the Buddha preach, they will be capable of reverent belief." At that time, Shariputra, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, "Dharma King, none more highly honored, speak, we beg you, without reserve. In this assembly of numberless beings are those capable of reverent belief." The Buddha repeated, "Stop, Shariputra. If I speak of this matter, the heavenly and human beings and asuras throughout the worlds will all be astonished and doubtful. The monks who are overbearingly arrogant will fall into a great pit." At that time, the world-honored one repeated what he had said in verse form. "Stop, stop, no need to speak. My law is wonderful and difficult to ponder. Those who are overbearingly arrogant, when they hear it, will never show reverent belief." At that time, Shariputra once more spoke to the Buddha, saying, "World-honored one, we beg you to preach. We beg you to preach. In this assembly at present, the persons like myself number in the hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, millions. In age after age, we have already attended the Buddhas and received instruction. People of this kind are certain to be capable of reverent belief. Throughout the long night, they will gain peace and rest and will enjoy many benefits." At that time, Shariputra, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, "Supremely honored among two-legged beings, we beg you to preach this foremost law. I, who am regarded as the Buddha's eldest son, ask you to favor us by preaching distinctions. The countless members of this assembly are capable of according reverent belief to this law. The Buddhas have already in age after age taught and converted them in this manner. All with a single mind and palms pressed together desire to hear and receive the Buddha's words. I and the other 1,200 of our group, as well as the others who seek to become Buddhas, beg that for the sake of this assembly you will favor us by preaching distinctions. When we hear this law, we will be filled with great joy." At that time, the world-honored one said to Shariputra, "3 times you have stated your earnest request. How can I do other than preach? Now you must listen attentively and carefully ponder. For your sake, I will now analyze and explain the matter." When he had spoken these words, there were some 5,000 monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen in the assembly who immediately rose from their seats, bowed to the Buddha, and withdrew. What was the reason for this? These persons had roots of guilt that were deep and manifold, and in addition, they were overbearingly arrogant. What they had not attained, they supposed they had attained. What they had not understood, they supposed they had understood. And, because they had this failing, they did not remain where they were. The world-honored one was silent and did not try to detain them. At this time the Buddha said to Shariputra, "Now this assembly of mine is free of branches and leaves, made up solely of the steadfast and truthful. Shariputra, it is well that these persons of overbearing arrogance have withdrawn. Now listen carefully and I will preach for you." Shariputra said, "So be it, world-honored one. We are eager to listen." The Buddha said to Shariputra, "A wonderful law such as this is preached by the Buddhas, the thus come ones, at certain times. But like the blooming of the Udambara, such times come very seldom. Shariputra, you and the others must believe me. The words that the Buddhas preach are not empty or false. Shariputra, the Buddhas preach the law in accordance with what is appropriate, but the meaning is difficult to understand. Why is this? Because we employ countless expedient means, discussing causes and conditions, and using words of simile and parable to expound the teachings. This law is not something that can be understood through pondering or analysis. Only those who are Buddhas can understand it. Why is this? Because the Buddhas, the world-honored ones, appear in the world for one great reason alone. Shariputra, what does it mean to say that the Buddhas, the world-honored ones, appear in the world for one great reason alone? The Buddhas, the world-honored ones, wish to open the door of Buddha wisdom to all living beings, to allow them to attain purity. That is why they appear in the world. They wish to show the Buddha wisdom to living beings, and therefore they appear in the world. They wish to cause living beings to awaken to the Buddha wisdom, and therefore they appear in the world. They wish to induce living beings to enter the path of Buddha wisdom, and therefore they appear in the world. Shariputra, this is the one great reason for which the Buddhas appear in the world. The Buddha said to Shariputra, "The Buddhas, the thus come ones, simply teach and convert the bodhisattvas. All the things they do are at all times done for this one purpose. They simply wish to show the Buddha wisdom to living beings and enlighten them to it. Shariputra, the thus come ones have only a single Buddha vehicle, which they employ in order to preach the law to living beings. They do not have any other vehicle, a second one or a third one. Shariputra, the law preached by all the Buddhas of the 10 directions is the same as this. Shariputra, the Buddhas of the past used countless numbers of expedient means, various causes and conditions, and words of simile and parable in order to expound the doctrines for the sake of living beings. These doctrines are all for the sake of the one Buddha vehicle. These living beings, by listening to the doctrines of the Buddhas, are all eventually able to attain wisdom, embracing all species. Shariputra, when the Buddhas of the future make their appearance in the world, they too will use countless numbers of expedient means, various causes and conditions, and words of simile and parable in order to expound the doctrines for the sake of living beings. These doctrines will all be for the sake of the one Buddha vehicle. And these living beings, by listening to the doctrines of the Buddhas, will all eventually be able to attain wisdom, embracing all species. Shariputra, the Buddhas, the world-honored ones, who exist at present in the countless hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, and millions of Buddha lands in the 10 directions, benefit and bring peace and happiness to living beings in large measure. These Buddhas too use countless numbers of expedient means, various causes and conditions, and words of simile and parable in order to expound the doctrines for the sake of living beings. These doctrines are all for the sake of the one Buddha vehicle, and these living beings, by listening to the doctrines of the Buddhas, are all eventually able to attain wisdom, embracing all species. Shariputra, these Buddhas simply teach and convert the bodhisattvas. They do it because they wish to show the Buddha wisdom to living beings. They do it because they wish to use the Buddha wisdom to enlighten living beings. They do it because they wish to cause living beings to enter the path of Buddha wisdom. Shariputra, I too will now do the same. I know that living beings have various desires, attachments that are deeply implanted in their minds. Taking cognizance of this basic nature of theirs, I will therefore use various causes and conditions, words of simile and parable, and the power of expedient means to expound the law for them. Shariputra, I do this so that all of them may attain the one Buddha vehicle, and wisdom embracing all species. Shariputra, in the worlds of the 10 directions, there are not 2 vehicles, much less 3. Shariputra, the Buddhas appear in evil worlds of 5 impurities. These are the so-called impurity of the age, impurity of desire, impurity of living beings, impurity of view, and impurity of lifespan. Shariputra, when the age is impure and the times are chaotic, then the defilements of living beings are grave. They are greedy and jealous and put down roots that are not good. Because of this, the Buddhas, utilizing the power of expedient means, apply distinctions to the one Buddha vehicle and preach as though it were 3. Shariputra, if any of my disciples should claim to be an Arhat or a Pratyeka and yet does not heed or understand that the Buddhas, the thus come ones, simply teach and convert the bodhisattvas, then he is no disciple of mine. He is no Arhat or Pratyeka. Again, Shariputra, if there should be monks or nuns who claim that they have already attained the status of Arhat, that this is their last incarnation, that they have reached the final nirvana, and that therefore they have no further intention of seeking Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, then you should understand that such as these are all persons of overbearing arrogance. Why do I say this? Because if there are monks who have truly attained the status of Arhat, then it would be unthinkable that they should fail to believe this law. The only exception would be in a time after the Buddha has passed away, when there was no Buddha present in the world. Why is this? Because after the Buddha has passed away, it will be difficult to find anyone who can embrace, recite, and understand the meaning of sutras such as this. But if persons at that time encounter another Buddha, then they will attain decisive understanding with regard to this law. Shariputra, you and the others should with a single mind believe and accept the words of the Buddha. The words of the Buddhas, the thus come ones, are not empty or false. There is no other vehicle. There is only the one Buddha vehicle. At that time, the world-honored one, wishing to state his meaning once more, spoke in verse form, saying, There are monks and nuns who behave with overbearing arrogance, laymen full of self-esteem, laywomen who are lacking in faith. Among the 4 kinds of believers, the likes of these number 5,000. They fail to see their own errors, are heedless and remiss with regard to the precepts, clinging to their shortcomings, unwilling to change. But these persons of small wisdom have already left. The chaff among this assembly has departed in the face of the Buddha's authority. These persons were of paltry merit and value, incapable of receiving this law. This assembly is now free of branches and leaves, made up only of those steadfast and truthful. Shariputra, listen carefully. For the law which the Buddhas have attained through the power of countless expedient means, they preach for the benefit of living beings. The thoughts that are in the minds of living beings, the different types of paths they follow, their various desires and natures, the good and bad deeds they have done in previous existences, all these the Buddha takes cognizance of, and then he employs causes, similes, and parables, words that embody the power of expedient means, in order to gladden and please them all. Sometimes he preaches sutras, verses, stories of the previous lives of disciples, stories of the previous lives of the Buddha, of unheard of things. At other times he preaches regarding causes and conditions, uses similes, parables, passages of poetry, or discourses. For those of dull capacities who delight in a little law, who greedily cling to birth and death, who, despite the innumerable Buddhas, fail to practice the profound and wonderful way, but are perplexed and confused by a host of troubles, for these I preach nirvana. I devise these expedient means and so cause them to enter into the Buddha wisdom. Up to now I have never told you that you were certain to attain the Buddha way. The reason I never preached in that manner was that the time to preach so had not yet come. But now is the very time when I must decisively preach the great vehicle. I use these 9 devices, adapting them to living beings when I preach, my basic aim being to lead them into the great vehicle. And that is why I preach this sutra. There are sons of the Buddha whose minds are pure, who are gentle and of acute capacities, who under innumerable Buddhas have practiced the profound and wonderful way. For these sons of the Buddha I preach this sutra of the great vehicle. And I predict that these persons in a future existence will attain the Buddha way. Because deep in their minds they think of the Buddha and practice and uphold the pure precepts, they are assured they will attain Buddhahood. And hearing this, their whole bodies are filled with great joy. The Buddha knows their minds and their practices, and therefore preaches for them the great vehicle. When the voice hearers and bodhisattvas hear this law I preach, as soon as they have heard one verse, they will all without doubt be certain of attaining Buddhahood. In the Buddha lands of the 10 directions, there is only the law of the one vehicle. There are not 2, there are not 3, except when the Buddha preaches so as an expedient means, merely employing provisional names and terms in order to conduct and guide living beings and preach to them the Buddha wisdom. The Buddhas appear in the world solely for this one reason, which is true. The other 2 are not the truth. Never do they use a lesser vehicle to save living beings and ferry them across. The Buddha himself dwells in this great vehicle, and adorned with the power of meditation and wisdom that go with the law he has attained, he uses it to save living beings. He himself testifies to the unsurpassed way, the great vehicle, the law in which all things are equal. If I used a lesser vehicle to convert even one person, I would be guilty of stinginess and greed, but such a thing would be impossible. If a person will believe and take refuge in the Buddha, the thus come one will never deceive him, nor will he ever show greed or jealousy, for he has rooted out evil from among the phenomena. Therefore, throughout the 10 directions, the Buddha alone is without fear. I adorn my body with the special characteristics and shine my light upon the world. I am honored by numberless multitudes, and for them I preach the emblem of the reality of things. Shariputra, you should know that at the start I took a vow, hoping to make all persons equal to me, without any distinction between us, and what I long ago hoped for has now been fulfilled. I have converted all living beings and caused them all to enter the Buddha way. If when I encounter living beings I were in all cases to teach them the Buddha way, those without wisdom would become confused, and in their bewilderment would fail to accept my teachings. I know that such living beings have never in the past cultivated good roots, but have stubbornly clung to the 5 desires, and their folly and craving have given rise to affliction. Their desires are the cause whereby they fall into the 3 evil paths, revolving wheel-like through the 6 realms of existence and undergoing every sort of suffering and pain. Having received a tiny form in the womb, in existence after existence, they constantly grow to maturity. Persons of meager virtue and small merit, they are troubled and beset by manifold sufferings. They stray into the dense forest of mistaken views, debating as to what exists and what doesn't, and, in the end, cling to such views, embracing all 62 of them. They are profoundly committed to false and empty doctrines, holding firmly to them, unable to set them aside. Arrogant and puffed up with self-importance, fawning and devious, insincere in mind, for 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 kalpas, they will not hear the Buddha's name, nor will they hear the correct law. Such people are difficult to save. For these reasons, Shariputra, I have for their sake established expedient means, preaching the way that ends all suffering, and showing them nirvana. But although I preach nirvana, this is not a true extinction. All phenomena from the very first have of themselves constantly borne the marks of tranquil extinction. Once the sons of the Buddha have carried out this path, then in a future existence they will be able to become Buddhas. I have employed the power of expedient means to unfold and demonstrate this doctrine of 3 vehicles, but the world-honored ones, every one of them, all preach the single vehicle way. Now, before this great assembly, I must clear away all doubts and perplexities. There is no discrepancy in the words of the Buddhas. There is only the one vehicle, not 2. For numberless kalpas in the past, countless Buddhas who have now entered extinction, 100, 1,000, 10,000, million types in numbers incapable of calculation. Such world-honored ones, using different types of causes, similes, and parables, the power of countless expedient means, have expounded the characteristics of teachings. These world-honored ones have all preached the doctrine of the single vehicle, converting countless living beings and causing them to enter the Buddha way. And these great sage lords, knowing what is desired deep in the minds of the heavenly and human beings and the other living things throughout all the worlds, have employed still other expedient means to help illuminate the highest truth. If there are living beings who have encountered these past Buddhas, and if they have listened to their law, presented alms, or kept the precepts, shown forbearance, been assiduous, practiced meditation and wisdom, and so forth, cultivating various kinds of merit and virtue, then persons such as these all have attained the Buddha way. After the Buddhas have passed into extinction, if persons are of good and gentle mind, then living beings such as these have all attained the Buddha way. After the Buddhas have passed into extinction, if persons make offerings to the relics, raising 10,000 or 1,000,000 kinds of towers, using gold, silver and crystal, seashell and agate, carnelian, lapis lazuli, pearls, to purify and adorn them extensively, in this way erecting towers, or if they raise up stone mortuary temples, or those of sandalwood or aloes, hovenia or other kinds of timber, or of brick, tile, clay, or earth, if in the midst of the broad fields they pile up earth to make a mortuary temple for the Buddha, or even if little boys at play should collect sand to make a Buddha tower, then persons such as these have all attained the Buddha way. If there are persons who for the sake of the Buddha fashion and set up images, carving them with many distinguishing characteristics, then all have attained the Buddha way. Or if they make things out of the 7 kinds of gems, of copper, red or white copper, pewter, lead, tin, iron, wood, or clay, or use cloth soaked in lacquer or resin to adorn and fashion Buddha images, then persons such as these have all attained the Buddha way. If they employ pigments to paint Buddha images, endowing them with the characteristics of 100-fold merit, if they make them themselves or have others make them, then all have attained the Buddha way. Even if little boys in play should use a piece of grass or wood or a brush or perhaps a fingernail to draw an image of the Buddha, such persons as these, bit by bit, will pile up merit and will become fully endowed with a mind of great compassion. They all have attained the Buddha way. Merely by converting the bodhisattvas, they bring salvation and release to numberless multitudes. And if persons, in the presence of such memorial towers, such jeweled images and painted images, should with reverent minds make offerings of flowers, incense, banners, or canopies, or if they should employ persons to make music, striking drums or blowing horns or conch shells, playing pipes, flutes, zithers, harps, balloon guitars, cymbals, and gongs, and if these many kinds of wonderful notes are intended wholly as an offering, or if one with a joyful mind sings a song in praise of the Buddha's virtue, even if it is just one small note, then all who do these things have attained the Buddha way. If someone with a confused or distracted mind should take even one flower and offer it to a painted image, in time he would come to see countless Buddhas. Or if a person should bow or perform obeisance, or should merely press his palms together, or even should raise a single hand, or give no more than a slight nod of the head, and if this were done in offering to an image, then in time he would come to see countless Buddhas. And if he himself attains the unsurpassed way and spreads salvation abroad to countless multitudes, he will enter the nirvana of no remainder, as a fire dies out when the firewood is exhausted. If persons with confused and distracted minds should enter a memorial tower and once exclaim, "Hail to the Buddha," then all have attained the Buddha way. If from past Buddhas, when they were in the world or after their extinction, there should be those who heard his law, then all have attained the Buddha way. The world-honored ones of the future, whose numbers will be incalculable, these thus come ones will also employ expedient means to preach the law, and all these thus come ones, through countless expedient means, will save and bring release to living beings, so that they enter the Buddha's wisdom, which is free of outflows. If there are those who hear the law, then not a one will fail to attain Buddhahood. The original vow of the Buddhas was that the Buddha way, which they themselves practice, should be shared universally among living beings, so that they too may attain this same way. The Buddhas of future ages, although they preach hundreds, thousands, millions, a countless number of doctrines, in truth do so for the sake of the single vehicle. The Buddhas, most honored of two-legged beings, know that phenomena have no constantly fixed nature, that the seeds of Buddhahood sprout through causation, and for this reason they preach the single vehicle. But that these phenomena are part of an abiding law, that the characteristics of the world are constantly abiding. This they have come to know in the place of practice, and as leaders and teachers they preach expedient means. The presently existing Buddhas of the 10 directions, whom heavenly and human beings make offerings to, who in number are like Ganges sands, they have appeared in the world in order to bring peace and comfort to living beings, and they too preach the law in this way. They understand the foremost truth of tranquil extinction, and therefore employ the power of expedient means, and though they point out various different paths, in truth they do so for the sake of the Buddha vehicle. They understand the actions of living beings, the thoughts that lie deep in their minds, the deeds they have carried out in the past, their desires, their nature, the power of their exertions, and whether their capacities are acute or dull. And so they employ various causes and conditions, similes, parables, and other words and phrases, adapting what expedient means are suitable to their preaching. Now I too am like this. In order to bring peace and comfort to living beings, I employ various different doctrines to disseminate the Buddha way. Through the power of my wisdom, I know the nature and desires of living beings, and through expedient means I preach these doctrines, causing all living beings to attain joy and gladness. Shariputra, you should understand that I view things through the Buddha eye. I see the living beings in the 6 paths, how poor and distressed they are, without merit or wisdom, how they enter the perilous road of birth and death, their sufferings continuing with never a break, how deeply they are attached to the 5 desires, like a yak enamored of its tail, blinding themselves with greed and infatuation, their vision so impaired they can see nothing. They do not seek the Buddha with his great might, or the law that can end their sufferings, but enter deeply into erroneous views, hoping to shed suffering through greater suffering. For the sake of these living beings, I summon up a mind of great compassion. When I first sat in the place of practice and gazed at the tree and walked around it for the space of 3 times 7 days, I pondered the matter in this way. The wisdom I have attained, I thought, is subtle, wonderful, the foremost. But living beings, dull in capacity, are addicted to pleasure and blinded by stupidity. With persons such as this, what can I say? How can I save them? At that time, the Brahma kings, along with the heavenly king Chakra, the 4 heavenly kings who guard the world, and the heavenly king Great Freedom, in company with the other heavenly beings and their hundreds and thousands and 10,000s of followers, reverently pressed their palms together and bowed, begging me to turn the wheel of the law. Immediately I thought to myself that if I merely praised the Buddha vehicle, then the living beings, sunk in their suffering, would be incapable of believing in this law. And because they rejected the law and failed to believe in it, they would fall into the 3 evil paths. It would be better if I did not preach the law, but quickly entered into nirvana. Then my thoughts turned to the Buddhas of the past and the power of expedient means they had employed. And I thought that the way I had now attained should likewise be preached as 3 vehicles. When I thought in this manner, the Buddhas of the 10 directions all appeared, and with Brahma sounds comforted and instructed me. Well done, Shakyamuni, they said. Foremost leader and teacher, you have attained the unsurpassed law. But following the example of all other Buddhas, you'll employ the power of expedient means. We too have all attained the most wonderful, the foremost law, but for the sake of living beings, we make distinctions and preach the 3 vehicles. People of small wisdom delight in a small law, unable to believe that they themselves could become Buddhas. Therefore, we employ expedient means, making distinctions and preaching various goals. But though we preach the 3 vehicles, we do it merely in order to teach the bodhisattvas. Shariputra, you should understand this. When I heard these saintly lions and their deep, pure, subtle, wonderful sounds, I rejoiced, crying, Hail to the Buddhas! Then I thought to myself, I have come into this impure and evil world, and as these Buddhas have preached, I too must follow that example in my actions. After I had thought of the matter in this way, I set out at once for Varanasi. The marks of tranquil extinction borne by all phenomena cannot be explained in words, and therefore I used the power of expedient means to preach to the 5 ascetics. This I termed turning the wheel of the law, and also with regard to the sound of nirvana and arhat, dharma, and sangha, I used these terms to indicate distinctions. From infinite kalpas in the past I have extolled and taught the law of nirvana, ending the long sufferings of birth and death. This is how I customarily preached. Shariputra, you should know this. When I looked at the Buddha's sons, I saw incalculable thousands, 10,000s, millions who had determined to seek the way of the Buddha, every one with a respectful and reverent mind, all coming to the place of the Buddha, persons who in the past had listened to other Buddhas and heard the law preached through expedient means. Immediately the thought came to me that the reason the thus come one has appeared is so he may preach the Buddha wisdom. Now is precisely the time to do so. Shariputra, you should understand that persons of dull capacity and small wisdom, who are attached to appearances, proud and overbearing, are incapable of believing in this law. Now I, joyful and fearless, in the midst of the bodhisattvas, honestly discarding expedient means, will preach only the unsurpassed way. When the bodhisattvas hear this law, they will be released from all entanglements of doubt. The 1,200 arhats, they too will attain Buddhahood. Following the same fashion that the Buddhas of the 3 existences employ in preaching the law, I now will do likewise, preaching a law that is without distinctions. The times when the Buddhas appear in the world are far apart and difficult to encounter, and even when they appear in the world, it is difficult for them to preach this law. Throughout incalculable, innumerable kalpas, it is rare that one may hear this law, and a person capable of listening to this law, such a person is likewise rare. It is like the Udambara flower, which all the world loves and delights in, which heavenly and human beings look on as something rare, but which appears only once in many, many ages. If a person hears this law, delights and praises it, even if he utters just one word, then he has made offerings to all the Buddhas of the 3 existences. But a person like this is very rarely found, rarer than the Udambara flower. You should have no doubts. I, being the king of the doctrines, make this announcement to the entire great assembly. I employ only the single vehicle way to teach and convert the bodhisattvas. I have no voice-hearer disciples. You, Shariputra, and the voice-hearers and bodhisattvas, you should understand that this wonderful law is the secret crux of the Buddhas. In this evil world of the 5 impurities, those who merely delight in and are attached to the desires, living beings such as this, in the end, will never seek the Buddha way. When evil persons in ages to come hear the Buddha preach the single vehicle, they will be confused, will not believe or accept it, will reject the law and fall into the evil paths. But when there are those with a sense of shame, persons of purity who have determined to seek the Buddha way, then for the sake of such as these, one should widely praise the way of the single vehicle. Shariputra, you should understand this. The law of the Buddhas is like this. Employing 10,000, a million expedient means, they accord with what is appropriate in preaching the law. Those who are not versed in the matter cannot fully comprehend this. But you and the others already know how the Buddhas, the teachers of the world, accord with what is appropriate in employing expedient means. You'll have no more doubts or perplexities, but your minds, filled with great joy, will know that you yourselves will attain Buddhahood. That was Chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, Skillful Means. Docs, what did you think?
Thought a lot of things. We'll go through them more or less in order, but a couple of overall things that kind of go through the whole chapter. First of all, there's a lot of the interdenominational sniping that we've talked about in previous episodes. It's pretty much the same as usual, so I don't feel a need to really dig into it. We've talked about it before, it's unfortunate, and it's also what we've got, so we just gotta deal with it. I do note, however, that at least in this chapter, overall, Shariputra comes out relatively uninsulted. He's asking questions that are perfectly reasonable in the context that's going on here. So it's interesting that he kind of degenerates gradually into more of a buffoon in later chapters, which we've already read.
Yeah, this is sort of the complicated thing about not reading this linearly. There's a very clear arc for Shariputra in this sutra, and it's unfortunate. It's not a good arc. The sutra starts out with him asking really reasonable questions and saying really reasonable stuff and having like a very good engaged conversation with the Buddha. But then later on, he just falls off and the sutra starts making him out to look like a complete idiot. And it's because of what we've talked about in other chapters. It's supposed to demonstrate that the Buddha is teaching something that, completely undercuts all of earlier Buddhism, and it's supposed to demonstrate that this is a higher teaching that even his foremost disciple Shariputra struggles to comprehend and understand. And it also speaks to, how the Buddha is completely flipping the entire system on its head. He's even leaving behind not just the Arhat path, the Pratyeka path, the Bodhisattva path. He's even leaving behind the idea that all three are, viable pathways with different destinations. And he's saying they're actually all the same thing. You've all been on it the whole time. I got you. You know what I mean? It's a very interesting thing. But here is still early in the arc, and here Shariputra is mostly okay.
Overall, the way Skillful Means is presented in this chapter, it kind of serves as a board wipe, a hard reset. In this chapter, there is information given that can basically be used to discount everything else that has ever gone on before. Skillful Means completely subsumes everything that was done previously. So this could not be a more extreme effect on the doctrine as a whole.
Exactly. And when you say that it sort of questions everything, it really does question everything. It doesn't just question, everything that's ever been taught or done. It also leads a lot of thinkers to question, is the entire world as we understand it a skillful means? Because when you put this together with the immeasurable life chapter 16, when you put this together with the idea or the doctrine of the primordial Buddha who has been enlightened for many eons past, it becomes clear that the Buddha can also create Pure Lands, can create Buddha realms as a skillful means for encouraging people to pursue the Buddha path and to pursue enlightenment. And that means that it's technically possible that the entire world we live in, the entire reality we experience, is a skillful means put on by this primordial Buddha, and that the Buddha manifests himself as Shakyamuni, or as Amida, or as Vairocana, or as whoever in the world to give the Dharma a face, to give it a spokesperson, to give it a performer who will encourage people, delight people, interest people, hook people in order to follow. And so that's kind of like you would say that's like a Tendai or an esoteric way to interpret the doctrine of skillful means together with the primordial Buddha.
So let's get into details for the text itself. So early in this chapter, we have discussion about how impossible it is for the Buddha to explain his experience via words. We've talked about the insufficiency of language before. I think we've read some fairly similar things in previous episodes. This idea is kind of like an inverse of the ideas that power eldritch horror stories. So in horror form, language fails to capture the horror of these things, places, entities that are beyond our ability to comprehend. Here, the Buddha is saying that language fails to capture the splendor of the Buddha's teachings and the way he thinks. In either case, this is a limitation of our minds. Our minds are too limited. The things that we're talking about are too large for us to fully comprehend.
In the case of eldritch horror, it definitely is our minds, our senses are insufficient for comprehending all of this. But in the case of the Buddha Dharma, it's really just language, speech, words, letters, etc. that fail to capture it. Because this whole idea is this feeling of self-realization of noble wisdom that we've seen in Zen sutras, like the Lankavatara Sutra. The idea is that you can't talk about it but you can have mind-to-mind transmission where the Buddha sort of transmits the Dharma from his mind to yours, or your master transmits it from their experience to your experience by use of skillful means, or it's through meditation and through practice and through faith. You can have this experience within yourself that transcends language, but is still something that your mind or something that you yourself can comprehend and understand. But that being the case, it is still incredibly hard and takes an incredibly long time and a lot of training. And at the end of it, you are omniscient. And so in that sense, it is definitely mind-breaking.
So moving forward, we see that among the assembly that is hearing the Lotus Sutra, and the framing device of the story includes 1,200 persons, and among them are Pratyeka Buddhas. So we've talked before a lot about how where Pratyeka Buddhas fit into the cosmology is it's hard to really define, because a lot of the sutras seem to contradict what the definition given earlier would allow. If a Pratyeka Buddha has heard the Buddha's preaching, then they, by definition, can't be Pratyeka Buddhas anymore, because Pratyeka Buddhas have never heard the Buddha speak. So it seems like this is a case where the authors of this work wanted to show scale more than accuracy, and so they kind of put Pratyeka Buddhas into an audience that they definitionally should not be able to be in, mainly to emphasize the importance of this teaching.
I think that's probably an accurate way to sort of diagnose why Pratyeka Buddhas are here. There's some ranges of explanations that you can get for this. One other explanation is that once a Pratyeka Buddha is fully realized, they're a fully realized Buddha, then when they hear the Buddha teach, they're not sort of going against their own Pratyeka Buddha definition, because they still became Pratyeka Buddhas without ever having heard the Buddha preach to them, right? So they're in this state now, and they can hear the Buddha teach after they've entered this state. But if that's the case, there's still a problem. And there's still a problem because Pratyeka Buddhas are fully realized Buddhas. And the argument of this sutra is that all Buddhas of the past, present, and future have always preached expedient means and the teaching of the Lotus Sutra and all of this other stuff. So if these are fully realized Buddhas, then they should know this, or they should have heard this, or they should have preached it themselves. And so in that case, there's still kind of an unclosable loop that is going on here. There's nothing that really sort of resolves them in terms of their definition for being there. So like you say, I think that it just simply does try to capture every being in the cosmology, because we've got regular people, we've got animals, we've got hungry ghosts, we've got hell dwellers, we've got gods of two different kinds, we've got arhats, bodhisattvas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and we've got a fully realized Buddha. So it is really trying to capture individuals from all 10 realms that we've talked about.
So, moving forward, we have the scene where Shariputra has to make 3 requests of the Buddha to get him to actually convey this message. 3 is a thing that comes up in a lot of stories. I do a lot of game design and playing video games, and there's a whole lot of things where you have 3 phases, or you need to do a task 3 times. And in general, this is because of how we see patterns in things. If a thing happens once, that could be an accident. Twice is a coincidence, but thrice is a pattern. If I hit the boss in a way that deals damage 3 times, the developer of a game can be confident that the player has actually learned how to do that thing, that they didn't do it just by accident. So it makes sense, and it makes a good flow in a story to base things on 3s.
Yeah, exactly. And this is not the only time that he does this either. So whenever the Buddha reaches enlightenment for the very first time ever, he has to be asked 3 times by Brahma to go out and teach and preach to others and lead them to enlightenment too. So this is a sort of repeated thing. And this scene is supposed to mirror the previous scene in that way. It's supposed to call us back to the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, because according to Tendai and Nichiren Buddhism, this is the second turning of the Dharma.
Makes sense. So then we get to a point where a portion of the audience just stands up and leaves. This happens before the Buddha starts talking about skillful means and doing the big subversion of the teaching that the Lotus Sutra wants to accomplish. So these are folks who knew what was coming and left beforehand. They were people who it's just interesting and strange to me that they leave before they hear the thing that they're supposed to object to. So what's going on here?
These guys are very interesting because eventually in the sutra, in a chapter that we probably won't read, they come back and they all get prophesied to reach Buddhahood in the future. It will be much longer than usual because they left and came back, and it'll be much longer than usual because, as the sutra says, they were of overbearing arrogance and they, disagreed with or rejected the teaching. But the question of why they left and what's going on there is still very interesting. So the sutra wants us to think that they knew what was coming, or at least they thought they knew what was coming, and they already knew they disagreed with it, and so they got up and left. So they must have seen where the Buddha was going with this. They knew that he was going to start talking about upaya, and they were like, no, we just don't even believe in the existence or the validity of this idea of upaya. We're not going to listen to this. We don't need this. We don't want this. And so we're just going to go. And so that's going to be some interdenominational sniping because it's sort of addressing how people who stick to the earlier teachings, they don't accept the validity of upaya. But this would have been the first time that anybody heard it. This would have been the first time that anybody got this teaching of upaya. And so how they knew is kind of interesting. I think that it's a case of the authors of the text feeding, what they believe to be the wrong view to that group of 5,000 and then resolving that wrong view later in the sutra. I believe it's like somewhere in chapter, I want to say early or mid 20s, like 23 or 22, they come back and the Buddha says, you're forgiven. We always knew that you were cool. You get your future Buddhahood in this many kalpas, blah, blah, blah. So I think that it's a case where the text is anticipating that it's going to be disagreed with, and it's addressing that before it can be disagreed with.
I've said before that these texts sometimes get so defensive that it becomes offensive, and this is one of those cases, it seems like.
Yes, it's definitely here and in other places going after people who disagree with it.
So later in the sutra, we get a mention of 62 wrong views. In the text we've got, this comes with a footnote saying 62 possible views that arise from the two views that there is existence and that there is no existence. The term is often used to refer to all the non-Buddhist views that were current in Shakyamuni's time. So I'm curious how much of a list there is of these views, if there's anything that survives that's referring to what these views are. I could see this very easily being reverse engineered by more modern readers to mean something that is contemporary to their time. So what do we know about this idea?
Yeah, this list of 62 is very well preserved, and we do have it. It comes from Hindu ways of thinking and from Buddhist ways of thinking. If you were to take like an Indian philosophy class, especially like an ancient Indian philosophy class or an ancient history class that's centered on India or South Asian religions or something, you would likely encounter this list. You wouldn't have to probably memorize it or anything like that, but you'd have to sort of know that it's out there and sort of understand its context. So like the footnote says, it comes from the two views, things exist or things don't exist. And these 62 different views are 62 different ways to qualify the statement, things exist or things don't exist. And we actually got 6 of these views in the other text we read and discussed, the Samanapala Sutta, where the king comes to the Buddha and says, I talked to these 6 other guys, and I want you to tell me why they're wrong and why Buddhism is right. You remember that those 6 other views were things like Jainism, atomism, fatalism, and more. I can't remember all 6 right now, but those were 6 of the different sort of worldviews that were circulating at the time. 6 at least of the most popular that the sutra saw fit to address. And there were more. There's 62 total. All of these are just different statements, such as things exist in the form of atoms, these things we can't see that are so small but also unchangeable. Things exist in the form of, maybe you could say, the combinations of the 5 elements. Everything is a combination of wood, metal, air, water, fire, etc. Or things don't exist, but they are projected onto our minds by a god. Or things don't exist, but they are, hallucinations of a god that we are all a part of. Things like that. These are all just different sort of views of how the world works and what reality is that come out and are categorized according to, they assume that things fundamentally exist in an unchanging way over time, or they assume the opposite.
Okay. Good to know that list at least exists. The existence of that list in a way that's been preserved makes it harder for somebody to hijack this idea. This could be something where if there isn't that list, a person could read their own views into that 62-point list.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and there are cases where in the Pali Canon, the Buddha does list these things off and say, these are 62 wrong views. And some have accused him of straw manning some of them, or at least straw manning some of the most popular ones. We talked about the potential that he was straw manning the top 6 views in the Samanapala Sutta. But either way, we still have both sides. We still have the list from people who believe those things, and we have the list from Buddhist canon as well.
Okay. So, moving forward, we have earlier discussions about how conveying enlightenment, conveying the Dharma, especially conveying through language, is insufficient. It's a very difficult thing to do. But then towards the end of this, we have the Buddha talking about some very simple, in many ways trivial ways that walks one into the path that will eventually result in Buddhahood. Like, you could just enter a memorial and hail the Buddha, and you are set. It's eventually going to happen. So, that's an interesting contradiction where in one spot we're talking about how difficult it is, and then here we're talking about how easy it is. Or at least easy it is to lock oneself into the desirable final outcome. On the one hand, this Dharma is difficult to transmit between the Buddha and non-Buddhas, but because it is so trivial in these instances, like that could be the start of ideas of original enlightenment, or actually, chronologically, how does the Lotus Sutra compare to the idea of original enlightenment, now that I'm here and thinking about it?
Yeah, the Lotus Sutra comes right before, just right before. And
okay.
You're right to see the hints of original enlightenment in here because, chronologically speaking, this is sort of the last iteration of Buddha nature before we get to original enlightenment. So we've talked on the koan episodes and in our episodes dealing with all sorts of Zen concepts that Buddha nature starts out as this sort of unrealized Buddhahood, this unrealized seed that will eventually turn into Buddhahood that everybody has. This idea that everybody does have it. And it can also never realize because you could choose against it. You could willingly reject it. And then later, the idea becomes, no, everybody's Buddha nature starts to result in enlightenment eventually, given enough time, because time is immeasurable. If there was a beginning and an end to it, then emptiness and impermanence wouldn't really work. It has to be infinite in a sort of immeasurable, no beginning, no end sort of way. The final iteration, it's not just enlightenment, it will actually result in full Buddhahood. And so we have the Lotus Sutra here saying, if you say even one word of the Dharma, if you see a statue of the Buddha and you say, Hail Buddha, then you're good, you're set, you're locked in. That is right before we get to the point where we say, actually, you are enlightened and have always been. This idea of the primordial Buddha starts to pervade how we understand, the path of enlightenment. They start to say, you were preached to the Buddha in the past. That's why you're encountering the Buddha's Dharma now, because you already had some sort of karmic connection. And so you just have to uncover whatever your bad karma is causing there to be delusions about. You have to undo whatever has happened to make it so that you have sort of fallen from grace, or whatever you would say. So that's sort of the trajectory of Buddha nature into original enlightenment. And right here, we're at the very last stage before we tip over into it.
It also serves as a way to reassure people intimidated by the complexity being described here. It's a pretty common thing in a lot of different religions to have some aspect that makes salvation, whatever that looks like within a given context, a lot more attainable than earlier, more strict ideas that are preached in the given religion. And I think this is a part of religion trying to make the idea of death less intimidating by having a fairly simple way of locking in one's eventual Buddhahood in this life. That serves to make the idea of death less intimidating to lay people, because they have this comfort of, here is the thing I've done, and the most important documents of my religion say that that is enough. We see all sorts of things like that elsewhere as well. So I think that's also what's going on with these simple ways to lock in a good result.
Absolutely, yeah. Death is at the forefront of all of this for a few reasons. I want to mention that it's not saying that you're locked into Buddhahood in this life necessarily.
Right.
Most of the people who get their prophecy get it for many, many kalpas in the future. But some cases it is this life. And it is absolutely dealing with the fear of death of oneself, but also of the Buddha himself. So there's this idea of, here's what I've done enough to at least be on the right path, to be on the way. But also there's the idea of, how do I get on the right path? How do I stay on the right path now that the Buddha's died? This sutra looks ahead to the fact that the Buddha will die, and there will be a world, so to speak, where you have to do the Dharma and live the Dharma without someone to guide you, without someone to teach you, without somebody who has already done the thing to help you do the thing. And this is putting to rest all the fears and anxieties that come with that. It's saying, all you have to do is read this. All you have to do is bow to the Buddha one time, or offer him incense or food, or offer an image of the Buddha, incense or food. All you have to do is just say one line of the sutra to yourself or to anybody else. And it encourages you to do that as much as you can so that the wheel of the Dharma continues to turn, and the age where the Buddha's teachings are still remembered is longer and longer and longer, but it still is sort of saying it's all okay. You're already on the path. You just have to do one small tiny thing. And in that situation, you can wait until the next Buddha, or you can sort of be all right while there is no Buddha right now.
Makes sense to me. So I think that covers all of my notes. Is there anything I missed that you think we should talk about?
That takes care of it for me too, I think.
All right. Well, in that case, I think we have an episode. This has been shorter than our previous discussions of the Lotus Sutra, but we're also doing a shorter reading, and we're also, having already done some Lotus Sutra work in the past, we don't need to go into as fine a detail because it's kind of stuff we've already covered.
Yeah, this is sort of like going back and just making sure that we got that one sort of foundational chapter and made sure we did that so that, everybody who's listening has this whenever they go into the parable of the burning house or into the immeasurable lifespan or any of the other chapters that we've read. So it's just cleaning house, so to speak, for the Lotus Sutra.
But it is also super important. By defining upaya as this chapter does, it has a huge radiating effect on everything that comes after. So absolutely worth doing.
Definitely.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this, and hope you learned something, and hope you join us next time. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. If you like our show and you want to financially support it, we ask that you instead send that generosity to support a worthy cause. For now, we ask that you support victims of the floods that struck central Texas in early July. As of this recording, there are nearly 120 people confirmed dead, with over 170 people still missing. We've included a link to GoFundMe pages in our show notes. If you can, please join us in helping these people recover from this tragedy. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.